Fix it by sundown, the big man said, his voice quiet in a way that was somehow worse than shouting. Or we burn this place to the ground with you still inside it. Caleb Turner was 19 years old. He had grease under his fingernails and $47 in his checking account, and he had just been handed a death sentence disguised as a work order. If you've ever had one moment where your whole life balanced on a razor's edge, where the next decision you made would either save you or end you, then you already know exactly how Caleb felt standing in that shop. This is that story. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that sweltering Tuesday afternoon in the San Joaquin Valley, because nothing that happened that day was supposed to happen, and every single second of it was real. The heat that Tuesday was the kind that didn't just sit on you, it pressed down like something alive and deliberate, like the valley itself had decided to squeeze the last breath out of anyone foolish enough to be standing outside in it. The temperature gauge on the exterior wall of Turner's Automotive and Cycle Repair had been reading 103 degrees since noon, and it hadn't moved in 3 hours. The asphalt in the parking lot had gone soft. A red-tailed hawk that had been circling the grain elevator across the road gave up sometime around 2 o'clock and disappeared. Caleb Turner was underneath a 1984 Honda Shadow that belonged to a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Petrakis, trying to diagnose a carburetor issue that had been driving him quietly insane for the better part of 2 days when he heard it. Not music, not traffic, not the distant moan of a semi working its way up the grade on the 99. This was something else. It started low, a growl so deep it was more felt than heard, something that moved through the concrete floor and up through his spine before it ever reached his ears. He stopped moving. The wrench in his hand went still. Every instinct in his body, every piece of animal wiring that humans carry around from 10,000 years of learning what predators sound like, fired at once. He slid out from under the Honda and stood up. The Harley came through the open bay door like it owned the building, like it had come to collect. He had never seen anything like it in his 19 years. He had grown up around motorcycles. His father had ridden his grandfather before that, and he knew what he was looking at in the technical sense. 1947 knucklehead, Pan-era frame, every inch of it period correct and immaculate, the kind of machine that belonged behind velvet rope in a museum, not rolling across a greasy shop floor, with heat shimmer still rolling off the exhaust pipes. The chrome caught the fluorescent light and threw it back in every direction. The engine breathed like something geological, like a small earthquake that had learned to idle. The man riding it was named Silas Henderson. Caleb didn't know that yet. What he knew, what was absolutely unmistakable before a single word was spoken, was the cut. Black leather sun-faded at the shoulders patches that told a story in the language of that world, a language Caleb could read well enough to feel the blood drain from his face. The death head, the bottom rocker. 3 simple words that changed every variable in the room the moment they walked through the door. Hell's Angels. Henderson Grip, to everyone who knew him, and most people who knew him only knew him by that name, was not a large man in the way that word usually implies. He wasn't especially tall. He wasn't built like a linebacker. But he had the kind of physical presence that fills a room in a way that has nothing to do with size, the kind that comes from years of being the most dangerous person in every space he occupied, and having that fact confirmed enough times that his body had learned to broadcast it without effort. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, with hands that had clearly been broken and reset more than once, gray threading through a dark beard that he kept close, and eyes that were the particular shade of flat, patient brown that Caleb would later describe as the color of waiting. He cut the engine. The silence that followed was enormous. Behind him, just inside the bay door, 2 younger men had taken positions on either side. Prospects Caleb understood, though he'd never been this close to the real thing before. They weren't doing anything threatening. They were just standing, watching. The specific kind of stillness that is its own kind of threat, the way a loaded gun sitting on a table is a threat without pointing at anyone. Grip swung his leg over the bike and stood beside it and looked at Caleb for a long moment without speaking. He looked at the shop, really looked at it in the methodical way of a man assessing something for its value or its vulnerability. The Honda up on the stand, the tool chest against the far wall with the third drawer that wouldn't close all the way anymore. The framed photograph above the workbench, Caleb's father, in front of this same building 22 years ago, back when the sign wasn't faded and the parking lot wasn't cracked. "You Caleb Turner," Grip said. His voice matched the bike low without decoration, carrying without effort. "Yes, sir." The sir came out automatically. He wasn't even sure why. It just seemed like the correct response to whatever was standing in front of him. Grip nodded once. "Your daddy ran this place." It wasn't a question. "He did. He passed 3 years ago. I've been running it since." "How old are you?" 19. Something moved behind Grip's eyes. Not quite amusement. Something more complicated than that. 19, he repeated like he was testing the weight of the number. "Yes, sir." Grip turned and put one hand on the knucklehead's tank almost gently, the way you'd rest your hand on the shoulder of someone you were trying to reach. "You know what this is?" Caleb looked at the bike properly. For the first time, really looked past the shock of the entrance and the terror of the cut and the prospects at the door. His eyes moved the way they always did when a machine was in front of him, automatically cataloging, reading, taking in information the way other people might take in a face. 1947 knucklehead, he said. Pan-era frame, looks correct for a 47. That's a real survivor build. That's not restored. That's original. Most of it. Who built it? Man named Roy Dunbar. He's been dead since 1971. Grip paused. This bike has outlived 17 people who've owned it or worked on it. Caleb wasn't sure how to respond to that. "It's got a problem," Grip said. "What kind of problem?" And then Grip told him. He described it in flat, precise terms, without drama, which somehow made it worse. Under 70 miles per hour, the bike ran like a song. Smooth, responsive, powerful in the way that old iron is powerful, not electronically managed, not computer-assisted, just pure mechanical energy that you felt in your chest and your hands and your teeth. Perfect. Under 70, this machine was as close to perfect as anything built by human hands could be. At 75 miles per hour, it died. Not gradually, not with warning, violently. The engine didn't sputter or fade. It stopped instantaneously, as though someone had reached in and unplugged it from the universe. The frame shook. The whole machine became suddenly terrifyingly unpredictable. And then it shut down completely, leaving a rider at highway speed on a dead motorcycle fighting physics and inertia and the hard shoulder of whatever road they happened to be on. "Twice," Caleb said. "Twice it nearly put me into a guardrail. Third time it happens, it won't be nearly." Grip looked at him with those flat, patient eyes. 4 mechanics before you. 2 in Fresno, 1 in Sacramento, 1 out of LA, who's supposed to be the best vintage iron guy on the West Coast. Nobody found it. Nobody fixed it. Caleb looked at the bike. He looked back at Grip. What did they check? Everything. What does everything mean specifically? Something shifted in the older man's expression, the first sign that he was dealing with someone who wasn't just going to nod and get out of the conversation as fast as possible. Plugs, fuel, electrical, compression, timming, carburetor. They put it on a dyno in Sacramento, watched it fail at exactly 75, couldn't find the cause. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He was already somewhere else, part of him, the part that had been taking things apart and putting them back together since he was 8 years old. The part that couldn't leave a puzzle alone, the part that had cost him 2 girlfriends and most of his social life because it simply would not disengage. He was already turning the problem over, already finding the edges of it. "I'll need to run some tests," he said. "I'll need time." "You have until sundown." Caleb looked up. It's past 2 o'clock. That's maybe 7 hours. 6.5, Grip said. He wasn't being cruel about it. He was just being inaccurate. "Fix it by sundown." He paused, and when he continued, his voice didn't change volume or tone in the slightest, which was the part that made Caleb's stomach turn completely over. "Or we burn this place to the ground with you still inside it." The 2 prospects at the door didn't move, didn't react. Like they'd heard this before, and it had always meant exactly what it sounded like. Caleb Turner stood in the middle of his dead father's shop with $47 in the bank and a payment on the building due in 11 days and a bike in front of him that 4 experienced mechanics had already declared unfixable. And he made a decision that he would spend years afterward turning over in his mind, wondering if it was the bravest thing he'd ever done or simply the only option that had ever actually existed. "I'll fix it," he said. Grip studied him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked toward the small office at the back of the bay and sat down in the chair that had been Caleb's father's, crossed his arms and waited. The prospect stayed by the door, and Caleb Turner got to work. He started with what he knew. That was the discipline his father had drilled into him from the time he could hold a socket wrench. Don't guess, don't assume, don't let what you expect to find make you blind to what's actually there. Start with what you know. Verify everything. Trust the machine to tell you the truth if you listen carefully enough. He pulled the spark plugs first. Not because he expected to find anything Grip had already said they'd been checked, but because his hands needed somewhere to start, and because looking at a plug under good light could tell you things about an engine that 6 other diagnostic steps would miss. He lined them up on a clean section of workbench and looked at each one under the fluorescent lamp. Perfect. Not good. Perfect. The firing ends were exactly the right color. The electrode gap was exact. There was no fouling, no carbon deposits, no oil contamination. These plugs hadn't just been checked. They were recent, high quality. Someone put new plugs in recently, he said half to himself. Sacramento. 3 weeks ago. Grip's voice came from the office without him moving or looking up. New plug wires, too. Caleb moved to the fuel system, pulled the petcock, checked the flow rate, disconnected the line, and watched the fuel run. Clean. No debris, no varnish, no water contamination. The carburetor de correct era Linkert, which alone was worth more than most cars Caleb had worked on, came off the manifold and went onto his bench. He pulled the bowl, checked the float level, measured the jets. He took 20 minutes on it because the Linkert deserved 20 minutes, because it was a piece of engineering history, and because he was thorough by nature and training. Everything was right. He put it back together and moved to the electrical system. This took longer because vintage electrical systems are their own kind of archaeology, layers of repair and replacement and modification laid down over decades, each one reflecting the knowledge and priorities of whoever had done it, creating something that was equal parts history and mystery. He traced every wire, used his meter on every connection, checked the magneto timing, looked at the grounds, followed each circuit from beginning to end. New wiring. Someone had done a professional job of it too, not a hack, not a bodge, but a careful, competent rewire that had respected the original routing while bringing the insulation and connection quality up to modern standards. Everything was right. He borrowed a compression tester and went through each cylinder with the same methodical patience. The numbers came back almost identical, exceptional compression, even across both jugs, the kind of result that told you the engine had been recently rebuilt by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. By 3 o'clock, Caleb had confirmed what the mechanics in Fresno and Sacramento and Los Angeles had already confirmed: there was nothing wrong with this motorcycle. He stood back from it and crossed his arms and looked at it the way you look at a math problem, where you've checked your work 3 times and gotten the wrong answer every time, knowing the error is there somewhere invisible, waiting for you to shift your perspective enough to see it. The bike stood there and told him nothing. Problem, Grip said from the office. Working on it. Clock's working too. Caleb didn't answer. He walked around the bike slowly, not looking for anything specific, doing the thing his father had called listening with your eyes, a phrase that had made no sense to him until he was about 12 and then had made complete sense forever after. Just looking, taking it in without agenda, letting the machine speak instead of asking it questions it didn't know how to answer. He looked at the frame, then he looked at it again. Something about the way the frame tubes set, something so small that he couldn't even name what it was, immediately made him stop. He crouched down, got his face close to the left lower rail, the one that ran beneath the engine from the front down tubes back to the swing arm pivot. He pulled his flashlight from his back pocket and clicked it on and looked along the tube the way you look down a rifle barrel, checking for true. Nothing. He almost moved on. He almost stood up and went back to the electrical system for another pass, because the alternative was admitting he'd been staring at this machine for an hour and had nothing. Instead, he pressed his thumbnail into the paint at the midpoint of the left lower rail and felt something move. Not the paint, not the surface, something inside the tube. A shift, a give, something that solid steel doesn't do. He pressed again, harder, definitely. Something inside there moved. Caleb sat back on his heels. His heart was doing something strange, not quite racing, more like it had skipped a gear and was now running slightly out of phase with itself. He took a slow breath and let it out through his nose. "I need to put her on the lift," he called toward the office. "Fine." He got the bike up on the hydraulic lift and positioned his light to come in from below and slightly behind the angle that would show surface irregularities on the underside of the frame tubes. He went across the entire lower structure this way, inch by inch, right side first, then across the bottom bracket, then the left. There, midway along the left lower rail, there was a seam. Not a weld, not a factory seam, a cut so clean it was almost invisible unless you had light coming in at exactly the right angle and you were looking for it specifically, and your eye happened to catch the hairline interruption in what should have been continuous surface. Someone had cut into this tube, had opened it up from the inside somehow, and then closed it again so perfectly that it had survived inspection by 4 professional mechanics, and God knew how many casual looks in however many years this bike had been running. Caleb's hands were steady. He discovered that about himself in crisis moments. His hands went steady while everything else in his body went haywire. Like all the adrenaline drained to somewhere useful and left his extremities perfectly calm. He pressed the seam area with his thumb. He felt the movement again clearer now that he knew what he was feeling for. Something inside that tube was not fixed in place. Something in there was designed to slide. He pulled his phone out and checked the time. 3:22 p.m. He stood up from under the lift and looked at the knucklehead from the side at the wiring harness that ran along that left lower rail, zip-tied to the frame at 3 points running between the magneto and the ignition switch. And then he understood. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. Under 70 miles per hour, the vibration frequency of the engine and frame would keep whatever was inside that tube seated against its stops passive, harmless, the wiring harness clear and undisturbed. At 75 miles per hour, the resonance frequency of the frame would change. Physics, harmonics, the same phenomenon that could shake a bridge apart if an army marched across it in step. At 75, the frame would hit a specific resonant frequency, and whatever was inside that tube would start to move, would slide, would shift, and in shifting would close around the wiring harness like a fist, pinching the ignition circuit, killing the engine, instantly, completely, every single time at exactly 75 miles per hour with the reliability of mathematics. He stood there in the middle of his father's shop and held that knowledge for 10 seconds, feeling it settle into him, and understanding as it settled that this was not a mechanical failure. This was not a mystery. This was a murder weapon. Someone had built this into the bike deliberately, had crafted a kill switch so precise and so hidden that it had fooled everyone who touched this machine, and which was designed, Caleb realized, with the cold clarity that follows a shock when your brain is running too fast to stop, to do something worse than strand a rider on the highway. At 75, it killed the engine. But Caleb could see, could feel in his mechanical understanding of what he was looking at, that the device wasn't at its limit at 75. At 75, it was activated. If a rider fighting a suddenly dead bike at highway speed instinctively dumped the clutch and tried to restart, tried to get power back pushed through if the bike somehow reached 80, the seam cut wasn't just around the wiring harness routing. It went around the structural cross-section of the tube itself. At 80 miles per hour, under the right combination of load and resonance, the frame would fracture. Not gradually, not with warning. It would snap mid-span under the engine, transforming a motorcycle into a collection of components with no structural relationship to each other at highway speed with a rider on top. And it would look exactly like a metal fatigue failure on a 70-year-old piece of steel. It would look like an accident. Caleb Turner straightened up slowly. He turned and looked at the office where Silas Grip Henderson sat waiting. He looked at the 2 prospects by the door who were looking back at him the way they'd been looking at him since they arrived, patient, blank attentive. He thought about walking out, telling them he couldn't find it, telling them to take the bike somewhere else, that he was sorry that he wasn't their man for this. He thought about it for almost 4 full seconds. Then he picked up his angle grinder and carried it to the lift. Whatever was inside that frame, Caleb was going to find it. And whoever had put it there, whoever had built a machine specifically designed to kill the man sitting 20 feet away in a dead man's chair, was going to have a very large problem on their hands. Because Caleb Turner had found something that 4 mechanics missed, and he was just getting started. He needed to open the frame. That sentence alone, those 5 words would have made any sane person in his position put down the tools and walk toward the door. You did not dismantle a Hells Angels enforcer's personal motorcycle. You did not cut into a piece of rolling history, a machine that had been built before television was common and had outlasted 17 people connected to it. You did not make that decision lightly or quickly or without being completely certain. Caleb wasn't completely certain. He was about 83% certain. Certain, which in the motorcycle repair business was not a number that justified what he was about to do. He walked to the office door. Grip looked up at him. "I found something," Caleb said, "in the frame, left lower rail midpoint." Grip's eyes didn't change. "What kind of something?" "I need to open the tube to be sure. I need to cut into the frame." He kept his voice level. It took effort. "If I'm wrong about what I think is in there, I've just destroyed a 70-year-old irreplaceable motorcycle. If I'm right," he stopped. "I need your permission." The room was very quiet. "What do you think is in there?" Grip said. Caleb told him. "Not the dramatic version, not the built-up storytelling version, just the mechanics of it, clean and precise, because that was the language that felt right for the moment, and because he suspected Grip had no patience for anything else. The cut, the sleeve, the resonance theory, the wiring harness. What would happen at 75? What would happen at 80? He watched Grip's face as he talked. It didn't move much, but something behind those flat brown eyes was moving, something slow and tectonic, like a shift happening far below the surface that wouldn't show itself completely for a while yet. When Caleb finished, the silence lasted for a long moment. "You're telling me," Grip said, "that someone built a way to kill me into my own bike?" "Yes, sir, that's what I'm telling you." Another silence. "Cut it open," Grip said. Caleb nodded once, turned back toward the lift. "Kid?" He stopped. "If you're wrong," Grip said, "and you've destroyed this bike for a theory." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "I know," Caleb said. He picked up the angle grinder. And outside, somewhere on the highway that ran past the edge of town, the sun continued its slow drop toward the western hills, dragging the deadline with it. The angle grinder screamed. Caleb had done a lot of things in his 19 years that required nerve. He'd told a customer their beloved truck was totaled beyond economic repair. He'd called the bank and asked for an extension on the shop loan 3 months running. He'd stood at his father's graveside at 16 and said the words out loud that needed saying, with his voice not breaking because someone had to, and there was nobody else. None of those things felt like this. The grinder bit into the paint on the left lower rail, and he felt the resistance in his hands change. Felt the moment the cutting disc went from surface coating to actual steel, and he kept his grip absolutely steady and his breathing absolutely even, and he did not think about what Grip had said. He thought about the seam. He thought about the hairline interruption in the tube surface that he'd seen under the flashlight. He thought about the movement he'd felt when he pressed his thumbnail against the metal. He was right. He had to be right. The cut took 4 minutes. He went slow, not because he was afraid, or not only because he was afraid, but because you didn't rush a cut like this. You went slow because you needed to stay above the thing inside the tube without touching it, because whatever was in there was precision engineered, and he needed it intact when he got to it. He needed to see it exactly as it had been installed. When he lifted the section of tube away with a pair of channel locks, the shop went so quiet he could hear the refrigerator running in the small kitchen behind the office. He looked at what was inside. It was elegant. That was the word that came to him first, and it turned his stomach because he could recognize craftsmanship even when the craft was murder. A steel sleeve machined to tolerances that must have cost someone real money to achieve sitting inside the frame tube with a gap of perhaps 3 millimeters on all sides. The sleeve was threaded on the outside at one end, a collar that had locked it in position against the inner wall of the tube, invisible from any external inspection. The inner bore of the sleeve had been machined to accommodate the wiring harness routing with a precisely calculated gap that kept the wires clear under normal conditions. And at the opposite end from the collar, the sleeve had a weighted section, a deliberate mass imbalance. When vibration reached a specific frequency, when the frame hit its resonant frequency at exactly 75 miles per hour, the weighted end would swing. The sleeve would rotate on its axis inside the tube. The gap around the wiring harness would close, and the ignition circuit would die. He reached in carefully with 2 fingers and confirmed what he'd suspected from outside. The sleeve wasn't just resting inside the tube. It was integrated with the frame's structural cross-section in a second way. There were 4 score lines barely visible, but they're cut into the inner wall of the frame tube itself surrounding the sleeve's position. Pre-stressed fracture points, designed to fail catastrophically at a higher resonance frequency. At 80 miles per hour, this frame wouldn't just shake. It would come apart at the scored points, folding inward around the engine, transforming the motorcycle's backbone into a hinge. Caleb set the channel locks down on the bench very carefully. He was aware of several things simultaneously. He was aware that his hands were still steady. He was aware that the 2 prospects near the bay door had moved without quite seeming to. They were 3 feet closer than they'd been a minute ago, and he hadn't seen them move. He was aware that Grip had come to stand in the office doorway, arms crossed, watching him with a particular quality of attention that Caleb was beginning to understand meant the man was being very, very careful about his reaction to something. "Show me," Grip said. Caleb didn't say anything. He stepped aside from the lift and held the flashlight at the angle that illuminated the inside of the open tube and waited while Grip came forward and crouched down and looked. The silence stretched for 15 seconds. Then Grip said very quietly, "Son of a bitch." "You see the score lines," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. "I see them." Whoever machined that sleeve knew what they were doing. This isn't improvised. This isn't somebody who got angry and got creative. This took time. This took equipment. This took someone who understood exactly how this specific frame would respond at specific speeds, which means they either know vintage iron or they had access to someone who does. He paused. "You told me 4 mechanics looked at this bike in Sacramento, LA, Fresno." Grip straightened up. Something had changed in his face, not fear. Nothing so simple as fear, but a kind of compression, like a pressure increasing behind the surface. "3 of them I called. 1 of them came to me." "Which one came to you, Sacramento?" Grip said. "Guy named Teller. Said he'd heard about the bike, wanted to look at it. Said he specialized in vintage iron." Caleb looked at him and didn't say what he was thinking. He let Grip get there himself. It took about 4 seconds. "He had the bike for 6 days, Grip said. His voice had gone very flat. "Brought it back and said he couldn't find anything." "When was this?" 8 weeks ago." Caleb nodded once. He turned back to the bike and thought for a moment about what he'd need and in what order. His brain had shifted fully into the mode his father used to call his machine state, the place where emotions stopped generating noise and everything became sequential, logical, solvable. There was a version of this problem that killed Silas Henderson. There was another version where it didn't. The difference between those 2 versions was the next several hours of work, and there was not a single second to waste on anything that wasn't that work. "I can fix it," he said. "The sleeve. The sleeve, the wiring, and the frame. If I leave those score lines in the tube and just remove the sleeve, the structural integrity is compromised. That frame needs to be cut back further and rebuilt with a solid steel insert fully welded. It'll be stronger than the original when I'm done." He looked at Grip. "But I need to be honest with you. What you have right now is a crime scene. This was built to kill you. I think you probably need to—" "That's not your concern," Grip said, quietly, definitively. "Your concern is the bike." "Yes, sir." "What do you need?" Caleb had already been building the list in his head. He named it out loud: tubing stock, the specific dimensions, which he had in the back, the TIG welder, which he had, the correct filler rod, which he was almost out of, a machined solid insert he'd need to fabricate himself because nothing off the shelf would be the right dimensions, and time. Time more than anything. "The tubing and the filler rod," he said. "I need to make a call. I know a steel supplier in Fresno who does emergency orders if you can get someone there to pick it up." Grip turned and said something to one of the prospects without raising his voice. The prospect was already moving toward the door before Grip finished the sentence. He pulled out a phone and held it toward Caleb. "Number." Caleb gave him the number from memory. The prospect was on the phone before he reached his bike outside. Caleb heard the engine fire up and pull out of the parking lot. 40 minutes, Grip said, maybe 45. "That's fine, I'll prep while he's gone." What followed was the kind of work that Caleb had been born for, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech, but genuinely in the way that some people are assembled by genetics and circumstance and early repetition into something that functions at its highest level when the problem is hard enough and the stakes are high enough and there is no room for anything except getting it exactly right. He prepped the frame with the care of a surgeon, cleaned the cut edges, measured the damage from the score lines, calculated the dimensions of the insert he'd need to fabricate, laid out his tools in the order he'd use them. Grip sat back in the office chair and watched him through the open doorway. At some point, Caleb wasn't sure exactly when, because time had become elastic, contracting and stretching in the way it does when you're deep in complex work. One of the prospects brought in 2 bottles of water and set one near Caleb's elbow, without comment. Caleb picked it up and drank half of it without looking up from what he was doing. "You always this quiet when you work?" Grip asked. "Mostly. Your old man the same way." Caleb set down the caliper he was using and was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, he was." "I knew him," Grip said. That stopped Caleb. He looked up. "Not well. We crossed paths maybe 3-4 times. He did some work for a guy we know in Bakersfield, maybe 15 years ago." Grip looked at the photograph on the wall, the one of Caleb's father in front of the shop. "He was the same way you are, didn't talk much. Let the work do it." Caleb didn't know what to do with that. He filed it somewhere and went back to his measurements. At 4:47, the prospect came back with the materials. Caleb had everything laid out and waiting. He took the tubing stock and the filler rod and didn't thank anyone, just moved immediately to the fabrication step because every minute now was load-bearing. He fabricated the solid steel insert on the bench grinder, checking the dimensions against his measurements 4 times in the process. Not because he doubted himself, because you checked 4 times on something like this. He took 40 minutes on the insert, and it was worth every second of those 40 minutes. Then he went to the TIG welder and started on the frame. TIG welding on vintage steel is an argument between the present and the past. The material is old, sometimes inconsistently alloyed, carrying decades of stress and expansion and contraction in its grain structure, and you have to listen to it, have to watch the puddle, the way you'd watch a face reading what it tells you about what the metal needs, adjusting your heat and your angle and your rod feed based on what you see rather than what the textbook says. Caleb had been TIG welding since he was 11 years old. His father had put a hood on his face and a torch in his hand, the way other fathers put baseball gloves on their sons, and he had been having that argument with old metal ever since. The welds went in clean, not just structurally correct, beautiful. The kind of bead that ran even and bright and full of the specific confidence that comes from doing something right. He was halfway through the second weld when Grip appeared in the doorway of the office and said, "Someone's been following this bike." Caleb lifted his hood and killed the torch. "What?" "Just got a call. Someone's been watching the shop since we got here." Grip's voice was still flat, still even, but there was something new underneath it. Not panic, not anger, yet something more controlled and more dangerous than either. Black truck parked on the access road behind the grain elevator. "Been there since we pulled in." Caleb looked at the frame. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was 5:53 p.m. "Someone who put that sleeve in the bike wants to know if it worked," he said. "That's what I'm thinking. They're waiting to hear that you left here on it and never made it back." Grip looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. "Keep working," he said. And then he turned and said something to the remaining prospect, too quiet for Caleb to hear, and the prospect pulled out his phone. The second weld went in. Caleb did 3 passes base fill cap and pulled the hood up and looked at the joint. He pressed it with his thumb, and it didn't move, and it didn't flex, and it told him nothing except that it was solid, which was exactly what he needed it to tell him. He started on the wiring. The harness had been pinched by the sleeve but not cut. That was luck, or rather it was the precision of whoever had built the device, because cutting the wires would have been detectable, would have shown up in any competent electrical inspection. The insulation was compressed at the contact points. The copper beneath slightly deformed the resistance at those points, measurably higher than it should be. He spliced out the damaged sections with fresh wire soldered the joints. Heat shrank each one individually and rerouted the harness with 4 inches of clearance from the rebuilt frame section. It was 20 minutes of work that he did in 12. He was reassembling the engine side when Grip said from the doorway, "That truck just moved." "Where'd it go?" "East, fast." Caleb didn't look up. "Someone tipped them off." "Looks like. Or they got tired of waiting and decided to check by another method." That possibility sat in the room between them for a moment. Then Grip said, "How much longer?" Caleb looked at what he had left. He calculated with the same part of his brain that was always running the math, the part that had been counting minutes and steps and margins since the moment the knucklehead rolled through the bay door. "Hour and 20, he said. "Maybe less if I don't hit problems." "It's 6:15. "I know what time it is." Grip made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Yeah," he said, "I believe you do." The next 75 minutes were the most intense of Caleb's mechanical life. Not because of the complexity, though it was complex, and not because of the time pressure, though. That was real and constant, a weight that sat on his shoulders and didn't lift. They were intense because he was doing something that had never been done to this machine in 77 years of its existence. He was taking it apart to its bones. He was removing the engine to access the complete lower frame, dropping it with the engine stand onto the shop floor, because he needed to see every inch of what he'd rebuilt from outside the frame in full light without anything obscuring his view. The knucklehead engine sitting on the stand next to the strip frame was the most beautiful thing Caleb had ever seen up close. He let himself look at it for exactly 3 seconds. The precision of those hand-fitted cases, the massive head castings, the push-rod tubes that were as much sculpture as function, and then he went back to work. He found 2 things he hadn't expected. The first was a second scoreline, shallower than the ones in the left lower rail, barely visible, even now on the right side of the front down tube. Not as deep, not as precisely placed. More like a test or like the beginning of something that hadn't been finished. He photographed it with his phone and ground it out and filled the area and went over it with the welder. And the whole time he was doing it, he was thinking about what it meant. This wasn't the first attempt. Someone had practiced on this frame before they installed the sleeve. Or someone else had started a different approach and been interrupted. He photographed everything. The second thing he found was scratched into the inner surface of the right side engine mount bracket, tiny, almost microscopic, done with something like a scribe or a hardened awl. 2 letters and a number, T7K. He photographed that too, said nothing about it to Grip, filed it in the same mental space where he'd filed everything else that wasn't his immediate problem to solve. When the engine went back into the frame at 7:41 p.m., it went in right. Every bolt torqued to spec, every connection, verified every hose clamp, checked and rechecked. The wiring harness lay clean and clear in its new routing, zip-tied at 5 points, no contact with any frame surface, 15 millimeters of clearance everywhere. He lowered the bike off the lift at 7:58 p.m. He filled the oil and checked the petcock and primed the carburetor and stood back and looked at the knucklehead standing on its own wheels and thought for a moment about his father, who had looked at motorcycles the way other men looked at paintings, who had told him once that a machine well made was a machine that carried its maker's intention in every part and every joint and every running surface, and that fixing a machine well was an act of respect for whoever had made it. He thought about what had been done to this machine. He thought about what he'd done to undo it. Then he put the Kickstarter down and brought the knucklehead back to life. The engine fired on the third kick. It caught and settled into that geological idle, that deep, unhurried continental shelf rhythm, and the entire shop vibrated with it. And Caleb stood with his hands at his sides and listened to it and knew with the certainty that comes from having listened to engines his whole life that it was right. It was completely, entirely right. He looked up. The clock on the wall said 8:03 p.m. The sun was gone behind the hills to the west. The parking lot outside was dark, lit by the single pole lamp at the road edge. And then the ground started vibrating in a different way. Not the engine, not on the shop floor responding to the knucklehead's idle. Something from outside, from the road, from multiple directions, from an approach that was still a mile away, but closing fast. A sound that multiplied and layered and grew until it wasn't just sound anymore, but pressure, physical pressure, the kind that you feel in your sternum and your back teeth simultaneously. Caleb turned toward the open bay door. Grip was standing in the doorway of the office, very still, phone in his hand. His face had changed. Something in it had opened up in a way that Caleb hadn't seen before and wasn't sure he knew how to read. "I made some calls," Grip said, "while you were working." The roar outside grew louder and louder and louder. The pole lamp in the parking lot went dark as the first headlight swept across it, and then the second, and the 10th, and the 50th. And they kept coming, and the ground kept shaking, and Caleb Turner stood next to a rebuilt death machine that was running perfectly for the first time in months, and outside filling every street and every angle of approach. 255 motorcycles arrived in complete perfect, organized formation and went absolutely silent all at once. The quiet that followed was the loudest thing Caleb had ever heard. He looked at Grip. Grip looked at the bike. Then he looked at Caleb. And something in those flat brown eyes was different now. Not softer exactly. Not warm in any simple way, but different. Like something had been weighed and the scale had moved. "You found it," Grip said. "I found it. You fixed it. Rebuilt it. It's better than factory now. Those welds won't fail." Grip nodded, slow and deliberate, the way a man nods when he's doing the math on something much larger than the immediate question in front of him. Outside in the dark, in the silence, 255 men waited. And inside the shop, the knucklehead idled on. Nobody moved. That was the thing Caleb would remember most clearly afterward. Not the sound of 255 engines going silent in the same instant. Not the way the pole lamp had gone dark under the sweep of that many headlights. Not even the feeling of the ground vibrating through the soles of his boots as they arrived. What he would remember was the stillness that came after. The absolute total stillness of that many men choosing simultaneously not to move. He had the knucklehead's idol to hold on to, that deep, steady geological rhythm. He focused on it the way a person focuses on a fixed point when the room is spinning. Not because it calmed him down, because nothing could have calmed him down in that moment, but because it gave him somewhere to put his eyes and his attention that wasn't the bay door and whatever was beyond it. Grip hadn't moved either. He was standing in the office doorway with his phone in his hand and his arms loose at his sides, and he was looking at Caleb with an expression that was doing several things at once, assessing, deciding, calculating. And Caleb had the distinct and uncomfortable feeling of being read like a machine. Like Grip was running diagnostics on him, the same way Caleb had been running diagnostics on the knucklehead all afternoon. "How long have you known?" Grip asked. "Known what specifically, Barshung?" That it was deliberate. Caleb considered the question honestly. "Since I felt the movement in the tube the first time, maybe 4 o'clock. I wasn't completely certain until I got it open. But yeah, since around 4. You kept working. You told me to fix it. I told you to fix it before I knew someone had tried to kill me with it." "The fix is the same either way," Caleb said. "The fix is the same whether it's a manufacturing defect or a deliberate modification. You still have to take it apart and rebuild it correctly." He paused. "The why changes some things, but not the work." Grip looked at him for another long moment. Then he uncrossed his arms and walked out of the office past Caleb and stood in the open bay door looking out at the dark and the silence and the 255 men who were out there in it. Caleb heard him take a long, slow breath. "You photograph everything?" Grip asked without turning around. "Everything I found, the sleeve, the score lines, the placement, the dimensions, and something else." He hesitated for exactly 1 second, then decided. "On the right side engine mount bracket, inner surface, scratched in with a scribe or something similar. T7K, 2 letters and a number." That got Grip's attention. He turned around. "Say that again." "T7K small, almost invisible, but deliberate. It was done carefully, not a random scratch." Grip's face did something complicated. The compression that Caleb had noticed earlier, that sense of increasing pressure behind the surface, intensified sharply, and then Grip controlled it visibly and completely, the way a man controls something he's been controlling for decades and has gotten very good at. He took another slow breath. "Send me those photos," he said, "all of them." Caleb sent them. Grip looked at his phone for a long time without speaking. Caleb went back to the knucklehead and checked the oil level again and rechecked the wiring connections at the magneto, not because there was anything left to check, but because he needed his hands busy. "I need to ask you something," Grip said finally. "Okay, and I need a straight answer, not a careful answer, not a diplomatic answer. Okay. In your professional opinion," Grip said those words with a kind of deliberate weight, like he was choosing them from a longer sentence. "Could a competent mechanic have found this without knowing to look for it specifically?" Caleb thought about that, really thought about it running through the 4 mechanics Grip had described, thinking about what a normal diagnostic process looked like, thinking about where the eyes go and where they don't go when you're working through a problem that presents as an engine issue. No, he said, not without either very specific knowledge of this type of frame modification or an unusual amount of time spent on the undercarriage looking at the structural members rather than the mechanical systems. Any reasonable mechanic running a reasonable diagnostic on a vintage bike that had an intermittent ignition failure at a specific speed would look at ignition, fuel, electrical timing. The frame would be an afterthought at best. And even looking at the frame, the seam was close to invisible. I only found it because I was at a point where I'd eliminated everything else, and I was doing that thing where you stop looking for the problem and just look. Grip nodded. It was the nod of someone whose calculation had just been confirmed, which means, Caleb said carefully, that whoever put it there knew exactly how mechanics work through a problem like this. They understood the diagnostic process well enough to build something that would survive it. Yes, Grip said, that's what it means. A motorcycle engine outside fired once, just briefly, and went quiet again. Like a clearing of a throat. Like a reminder. Grip walked back into the office and made a phone call. He spoke quietly enough that Caleb couldn't make out words, just the rhythm of the conversation, short, direct, informational. He was on the phone for less than 2 minutes. When he came back out, his face had settled into something harder than before, something that had moved past the compression stage and arrived somewhere colder. 3 men are coming in, he said. From outside, I need you to stay in the shop and keep your hands visible and not make any sudden movements because the men coming in are going to be in a specific kind of mood and I'd rather not have a misunderstanding. Caleb put his hands in his pockets, then thought about it and took them back out and put them on the workbench in front of him. What kind of mood? The kind that happens, Grip said, when someone finds out there's a traitor in the house. He said it the same way he said everything flat, even without drama, which was the most dramatic possible way to say it. The 3 men came through the bay door 30 seconds later. The first 2 were built the way structural supports are built, not for appearance, for function. They moved with the specific economy of men who had spent years in situations where wasted motion had consequences. The third man was older, maybe 60, with close-cropped white hair, and the kind of face that had been weathered past the point of reading. He wore a cut with officer patches that Caleb didn't examine too closely. He looked at the knucklehead first, then at Caleb, then at Grip. This the kid, the white-haired man said. This is Caleb Turner, Grip said. His father ran this shop before him. He found the device. The white-haired man, whose name Caleb would later learn was Dutch, though he didn't know that yet, walked to the bike and crouched down and looked at the repaired section of frame with a flashlight that had materialized from somewhere on his person. He looked for a long time. When he stood up, something in his face had changed, not softened, but shifted the way a judgment shifts when new evidence arrives. T7K, Dutch said, and it wasn't a question. Kid found it scratched in the engine. Sound mount night, Grip said. Dutch looked at Caleb. Directly, fully, the kind of look that felt like being physically touched. You know what that means? No, sir. You sure you don't know what it means? I've never heard it before today. Dutch looked at Grip. Something passed between them, wordless, complete, the communication of 2 men who had known each other long enough to have a language that didn't require language. We need to make some calls, Dutch said. Already started, Grip said. Dutch turned back to Caleb. Those photos you sent, you deleted them off your phone after you sent them. The question landed with a very specific weight. Caleb understood immediately what was being asked and what the answer needed to be and why. Yes, sir, he said. Dutch studied him for another moment. Then he nodded once the same way Grip had nodded earlier. Smart kid, he said. He walked out of the bay door into the dark without another word. The 2 larger men stayed. Grip came to stand beside the knucklehead. He put his hand on the tank, the same gesture he'd made when he first came in, that almost gentle quality to it, like touching something he'd thought he might lose. She ready to ride, he said. She needs a test ride before I can certify her. You need to take her up to highway speed and come back and tell me if there's anything I need to address. At 75. Especially at 75. Grip looked at him. You're confident. In the rebuild, yes. Not in your voice. Caleb met his eyes. I'm confident in the rebuild. I'm telling you accurately that it needs a test before I can tell you it's done. Those are 2 different things. Something shifted in Grip's expression. something that might in a different face have been called respect. "All right," he said, "I'll take him out. I want to come." The words were out before Caleb had made the decision to say them. He'd think about that later, about the gap between deciding and saying, about how sometimes the body knows something before the mind gets there. He kept his face even and looked at Grip and waited. "Why?" Grip said. It wasn't a question either. Because if something goes wrong at speed, the rider's first instinct is going to be to control the bike, not to analyze the failure. If I'm following, I can see what happens from outside the crisis, and I can tell you what to address when you get back. He paused. And because I built it, it's my work. I want to see it run. Grip studied him for a long time. "You ride," he said finally, "since I was 12. "What do you ride?" "A '76 Sportster. It's in the back." Another long moment. Then Grip said, "Get your bike." The Sportster had been his father's before it was his, and it showed not in its condition, which Caleb maintained with the same obsessive precision he applied to everything mechanical, but in its character. It was a working bike, not a showpiece. It had miles on it, real miles, the kind accumulated over decades of actual use, and it moved with the particular confidence of a machine that had been ridden hard and maintained well, and had come to an arrangement with its owner about what each of them was capable of. Caleb rolled it out into the parking lot and looked at the dark for the first time since the formation had arrived. They were everywhere. Not loud, not aggressive, not doing anything threatening in any active way. Just present. 252 men. The other 3 were inside, arranged across every available surface around the shop on their bikes, standing leaning against the building, sitting on the tailgate of someone's truck. The pole lamp was back on, and in its light, Caleb could see faces, and the faces were watching him with the same quality of attention the prospects had shown all afternoon, patient, complete, missing nothing. He rolled the Sportster to the edge of the parking lot and stopped. Grip came out behind him on the knucklehead. The sound of it in the open air was different than it had been in the shop. Fuller. The valley gave it something to bounce off the dry hills to the east, the flat agricultural expanse to the west, and it came back as something larger than itself, as though the landscape was amplifying it. For a moment, Caleb just listened. Listened to what he'd built. Listened to whether it was right. It was right. Grip pulled up beside him, looked at him. Caleb nodded. They went east on the county road, which was straight and empty at this hour, running between fields that smelled of irrigation water and cut alfalfa. The kind of road built for exactly one thing, going fast in a straight line, and Caleb let the Sportsters out to follow and watch the knucklehead's tail lamp moving ahead of him in the dark. 60 miles per hour, 65. He watched the bike, watched the way it tracked straight, stable to the frame, doing exactly what frames are supposed to do, which is hold everything in the correct relationship to everything else so that the machine can do its work without interference. He watched the body language of the man riding it, whether Grip was fighting anything, whether the handling was communicating a problem that hadn't shown itself yet. Grip rode with the absolute ease of someone who had 10,000 miles in his body, who processed the road through instinct so practiced it had become reflex. 70, 72, 74. Caleb held his breath without knowing he was holding it. 75. The knucklehead didn't miss a beat. It sang. That was the only word for it. It sang the engine note, rising and holding, and the bike tracking perfectly true. No hesitation, no death. No catastrophic resonance cascade in the rebuilt frame. The wiring harness sat where he'd put it, clear and clean and unaffected. The solid steel insert he'd fabricated and welded into the lower rail was doing its job, had always been going to do its job because he'd built it correctly. 80 miles per hour, 85. Grip held it there for 5 full seconds, long enough for Caleb to verify and re-verify, and then backed it down smooth and controlled, and they came back through 60 and 50 and turned at the crossroads and came back west toward the lights of the shop. When they pulled into the parking lot, everything changed. Not dramatically, not with a speech or a moment, but Caleb could feel the shift in how the men in that parking lot were looking at him as he rolled the Sportster to a stop. The small adjustments in posture and expression that meant something had been decided in his absence. Something that Dutch had set in motion with his phone calls during the test ride. Grip killed the knucklehead and sat on it for a moment without moving, in the specific stillnesses of someone processing something at full depth. Then he swung his leg over and stood beside it and turned to face Caleb. It's right, Caleb said. The bike is right. I'd stake my reputation on it. You already did, Grip said. Something in his voice was different. Some of the flatness had gone out of it, replaced by something that still wasn't warmth exactly, but was adjacent to warmth in the way that late October sunlight is adjacent to summer. Different in intensity, but recognizable as the same source. Dutch materialized from somewhere in the formation. He had a phone to his ear, and he was listening rather than talking, his face doing the complex work of receiving information that was clearly significant. He held up one finger, wait, and listened for another 30 seconds, then lowered the phone. He looked at Grip. It's Teller, he said. The name dropped into the parking lot like something heavy dropped from a height. Caleb watched the formation, actually watched it the way he'd watch an engine for a response to a diagnostic input, and saw the ripple move through it. Not loud, just real. The way news that confirms what people already suspected moves through a room. Teller, the mechanic from Sacramento. The one who had come to them, the one who'd had the bike for 6 days. Grip's face did nothing visible. Where? Flagstaff. He's been there 3 days. Dutch paused. He made a phone call 2 hours ago, to a number we've been watching for a different reason. How long have you known about the number? Long enough. Dutch glanced at Caleb, a brief professional assessment, and then back to Grip. He was in the parking lot of a gas station on the I-40 when he called. Security camera puts him there. He waited 40 minutes and then drove east. He was waiting, Grip said, for news that didn't come. Dutch looked at the knucklehead. He was waiting to find out that you didn't make it home. The formation was very quiet. Caleb thought about the black truck, the one that had been parked on the access road behind the grain elevator when the bikes arrived, the one that had pulled out fast and gone east. He thought about the timing the call Grip had gotten the truck moving the direction. East. He thought about Flagstaff, which was east. The truck, Caleb said. Both men looked at him. The black truck that was parked on the access road. It went east. What time did Teller make his call? Dutch looked at his phone. 8:17. Caleb looked at the clock through the shop window. It was 8:51 now. He did the math quickly, driving time the moment he'd fired the engine, the moment Grip had made his calls. He was watching the shop himself, Caleb said. Or someone was watching for him. They saw the formation arrive. They saw I hadn't closed the shop. They called Teller to tell him something had gone wrong and he needed to move. Dutch and Grip looked at each other again. Smart kid, Dutch said again. But this time it meant something different. Grip turned and spoke to the formation. Not loudly, he didn't need to speak loudly, just clearly, directly the way a man speaks when he knows he will be heard. He said 3 sentences. Caleb didn't catch all of it, but caught enough the name, the direction, the instruction. He watched 12 bikes pull out of the formation and disappear east down the county road in a group that moved with a speed and purpose that was not casual and not uncertain. Then he turned back to Caleb. There's something I need to tell you, Grip said, about T7K. Caleb waited. It's not a code. It's not a tag. It's a signature. Grip watched his face as he said it. Teller's real name is Thomas Kendrick. He's been going by Teller for 11 years. But before that, before he came into our world, he used to mark his work that way when he was a fabricator. Custom metalwork, high-end builds, racing frames. He paused. T.K. Thomas Kendrick. The 7 is the year he started 1997. He signed everything he built with that mark. The weight of that settled over the parking lot. He hadn't just built the kill device, he'd signed it. Out of habit or arrogance or some instinct for ownership that he couldn't suppress, even when the thing he was building was a murder weapon. Thomas Kendrick, who had come to Grip with a story about hearing about a legendary bike who had spent 6 days with a knucklehead in his shop in Sacramento, had scratched his signature into the inside of the engine mount bracket like a craftsman marking his work. He was proud of it, Caleb said. He was proud of it, Grip agreed. The formation that was watching, 240 men quiet in the dark listening, and Caleb Turner stood in the middle of all of it and felt the full weight of the afternoon pressing down on him for the first time since he'd first slid out from under Mrs. Petrakis' Honda and heard that growl coming from the road. He'd been moving since then. Moving and working and thinking and solving, and the motion had kept the weight at bay the way speed keeps a bicycle upright where stillness would let it fall. Now he was still, and the weight was considerable. He looked at Grip. "What happens now?" he said. Grip looked at him for a long moment. Something was working in his face, something that was Caleb thought the closest thing he'd seen to conflict in the man's expression all afternoon. "For the bike," Grip said, "you're done. It's right. You did what you said you'd do. And for the rest of it, that's not your concern." "You said that before," Caleb said, "about something else." Grip looked at him with those flat, patient, dangerous eyes. "I found the device," Caleb said. "I rebuilt the bike. I found the signature. I'm already in the rest of it, whether it's my concern or not." He hadn't planned to say that, but it was true, and he'd decided sometime in the last 30 seconds that the truth was the only thing worth saying right now in this parking lot, surrounded by this many men with this much at stake. Grip was quiet for a long time. Dutch watched from 10 feet away and said nothing. Somewhere out on the county road, 12 bikes were pushing east into the dark, toward a man who had built a machine to kill his friend and signed his name to it. "Go inside," Grip said finally. "Make some coffee if you have it. We need to talk, the three of us, and it's going to take a while." Caleb looked at him. "You're right," Grip said. "You're already in it." He paused. "So you might as well be informed." Caleb turned and walked back into the shop. The knucklehead sat on its kickstand behind him, running perfectly stronger than it had ever been, rebuilt from the bones up by a 19-year-old with grease under his fingernails and $47 in the bank. Inside the coffee maker was where it always was. He filled it and turned it on and stood next to it in the quiet and listened to the sound of 240 men waiting in the dark outside and tried to slow his heart down to something approaching normal. It didn't quite work, but it was closer than he would have expected. The coffee maker finished its cycle, and Caleb poured 3 cups and set them on the workbench and stood back and waited. His hands had finally stopped being steady. Not shaking, nothing so dramatic as that, just the fine, almost imperceptible tremor that arrives when adrenaline has been burning for 6 hours and the body starts presenting the bill. He wrapped both hands around his own cup and let the heat work on them. Grip came in first, then Dutch, and they arranged themselves around the workbench in the unspoken geometry of men who have held difficult conversations in worse places than this. Dutch picked up his coffee and looked at it and set it back down. Grip took 1 sip and held the cup. "Teller worked with us for 11 years, Grip said. "No preamble, no easing into it. Custom fabrication restoration framework. He was the best vintage Iron Man in Northern California, maybe the coast." He paused. "We trusted him with everything. Bikes, logistics, 2 properties we own in the valley." "Properties meaning real estate," Caleb said. "Properties meaning things more valuable than real estate." Grip looked at him steadily. "The kind of access that if someone wanted to damage us, really damage us, not just inconvenience us, they'd need exactly what Teller had." Dutch picked up his coffee again and this time drank from it. 8 months ago, we started noticing small things. Inventory discrepancies. A shipment that went to the wrong coordinates. A name that showed up in a conversation it shouldn't have appeared in. Nothing that pointed anywhere specific. Just friction. The kind of friction that doesn't happen by accident. "You suspected him 8 months ago," Caleb said. "We suspected someone," Dutch said. "The circle of people with the right access was 12. Teller was on the list, but so were 11 others, and we had no more reason to look at him than any of them." He set down the cup. "Until the bike." Caleb thought about that. About the timeline, 8 months of a slow leak somewhere in the organization, 12 people under suspicion, and then a kill device in the frame of Grip's personal motorcycle. "He escalated," Caleb said. "Whatever he was doing before, whatever he was passing along, that wasn't the end goal. He was building towards something." "Yes," Grip said. "Why now? Why this way? If he had that level of access for 11 years, why?" "Because something changed 8 months ago," Dutch said. "On our side. A restructuring of how certain decisions get made and who makes them." He glanced at Grip. Grip moved up, more authority, more visibility, and Teller was passed over for something he'd been expecting for a long time. Caleb looked at Grip. "He wanted your position." "He wanted what comes with it," Grip said. "And he'd been patient about it for a very long time." And then the door closed. Something moved through his face, not quite guilt, not quite regret, something more complicated. "I knew he was disappointed. I didn't know disappointed had become something else." The three of them were quiet for a moment. Outside, the formation was still there. Caleb could feel it in the same subauditory way he'd felt it when they arrived, that collective presence registering below sound more like weather than noise. "There's more," Dutch said. Grip looked at his coffee. "The number teller called in Flagstaff," Dutch said. "The one we'd been watching for a different reason. It connects to a federal case out of Phoenix, an investigation that's been running for about 14 months. He paused, choosing the next words with visible precision. Teller wasn't just trying to move up. He was trying to buy his way out of a problem by offering up something valuable. The room went very still. "He was talking to federal investigators," Caleb said. "He'd been talking to federal investigators for 14 months, Dutch said. And the information he was feeding them was real, specific, detailed." Another pause. The kind of detail that only comes from someone who was actually inside and paying close attention for a very long time. Caleb thought about what that meant, about the 11 years, about all the things Teller had been trusted with, about how long 14 months was and how much damage could be done in that time by someone with real access and real knowledge and a reason to use it. And then someone in the investigation told him his usefulness had limits, Grip said quietly, that what he was providing wasn't going to be enough to get him what he needed, that he'd have to provide something more definitive. "Or he decided that on his own," Dutch said. "We don't know which yet." Caleb looked between them. "So he built the device." "He built the device," Grip said. "Kill me. Let the resulting chaos create the conditions he needed and walk away clean to wherever he was planning to go. The investigation gets what it was working toward through the chaos. He gets protection and a new life." He set down his coffee cup with a gentleness that was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. Except a 19-year-old found what 4 other mechanics missed. Caleb didn't say anything. "The photos you sent me," Grip said, "I forwarded them to 3 people before you and I went on that test ride. People who know how to read what they were looking at." He looked at Caleb directly. "This conversation is happening because those 3 people have now had time to look at what you found and confirm that you found what you found, that this isn't a mistake or a misread." His voice was absolutely even. "You understand what I'm telling you. You needed to verify that I was telling the truth," Caleb said, "before you trusted any of it." "Before I trusted any of it," Grip confirmed. "Yes." "That's fair," Caleb said, and meant it. Dutch's phone buzzed. He looked at it, and his expression shifted. Nothing dramatic, just the slight recalibration of someone receiving information they were waiting for, but weren't entirely sure about until it arrived. He showed the screen to Grip. Grip read it. He was still for a moment. Then he said, "They found the truck, the black truck from the access road, east toward Flagstaff, toward the I-40, and a man at a gas station payphone who had made a call and then driven away fast." Caleb didn't ask what "found" meant in this context because the answer was in the quality of the silence that followed the word, and he had decided sometime in the last hour that there were specific things it was better not to know in detail. "Teller," he said instead. "Not yet," Dutch said, "but close." He pocketed his phone. "Kid, I'm going to ask you something, and the answer you give me matters, so take a second before you give it." Caleb looked at him. "What you've seen and heard tonight, all of it, the device, the photos, T7K, this conversation, what's your intention with it?" He had thought about this. Not specifically, not in so many words, but he had thought about it in the background, while his hands were working and his foreground brain was solving the mechanical problem. He'd thought about it the way you think about a weight you know you're going to have to carry, eventually assessing it before you pick it up. "My intention," Caleb said, "is to run my father's shop, pay the loan, fix what people bring me." He met Dutch's eyes. "I didn't ask to be part of whatever this is. I was handed a bike and a deadline, and I did the job. What I know is that someone tried to kill a man using a machine that was brought to me to fix. I fixed it. That's where my part ends." Dutch looked at him for a longer time. The specific quality of that look, measured professional arriving at a conclusion, reminded Caleb of the way he looked at a weld before he decided whether it was good. "All right," Dutch said. "There's something else," Grip said. Both of them looked at him. Grip was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone deciding not how to say something, but whether to say it at all. When he decided, he turned fully toward Caleb. 3 weeks ago, before I knew about the device, before any of this came together, I had a conversation with someone about this shop." Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. The loan on this building, Grip said. Omaswan. It's held by a private lender out of Bakersfield. You're 11 days from a payment you can't make. The tightening got worse. How do you know that? Because the lender is a man named Phil Coretti, and Phil Coretti has done business with us for a long time. And 3 weeks ago, he mentioned in passing, not as anything meaningful, that the Turner kid was going to lose his old man's shop before the end of the month. Grip paused. I had already planned to deal with that before tonight. It wasn't charity. Coretti owes us a conversation, and that conversation was going to include your loan. Caleb stared at him. I'm telling you this now, Grip said, because I want you to understand that what I'm about to say is not a payment for tonight. Tonight changes the scale of what we're talking about. But the direction was already set. He held Caleb's eyes. Your loan is gone. Coretti will make a call tomorrow morning. The debt is cleared, the lien releases, the building is yours free. He paused. That's separate from tonight. Caleb's throat did something complicated. He looked at the workbench. He looked at the photograph of his father. He looked back at Grip. Why, he said. 3 weeks ago, why? Because your father did good work for people we respect. Because this shop has been here for 22 years and it deserves to keep being here. And because Grip stopped. He seemed to be doing something unusual, which was searching for the right words. Because I know what it's like to try to hold on to something your father built with his hands. And I know what it costs. The shop was very quiet. Caleb put his coffee down and put both hands flat on the workbench and took a slow breath. Thank you, he said. It was inadequate, and it was the only thing available. Grip nodded once. Tonight changes the rest of it, he said, and his voice had moved back to its regular register flat, even carrying without effort. What you did here, finding what 4 professionals missed, making the call to open the frame, rebuilding it correctly under deadline, that's not something we forget. And we don't leave debts open. Dutch pulled a folded envelope from inside his cut and set it on the workbench beside Caleb's hands. Payment for the work, he said. Actual payment. Open it later. Caleb left it where it was. There's something I want to offer you, Grip said. Not tonight, you've had enough thrown at you. But in the next few days when you've had time to think. He looked around the shop at the tools to lift the photograph. We have bikes, a lot of bikes, across multiple charters, across the state. Good machines, some of them, and some of them in need of the kind of work that requires someone who understands what they're looking at. We've been using 3 different shops for that work, and 2 of the 3 are compromised now for obvious reasons. He looked back at Caleb. We need a shop we trust, run by someone we know, someone who's shown us what he's capable of under the worst possible conditions. Caleb looked at him. Think about it, Grip said. That's all I'm asking tonight. Dutch's phone buzzed again. Ian. He looked at it, and this time the shift in his expression was larger, something that moved from waiting to arrived. He turned the screen toward Grip. Grip read it. He was still for 3 full seconds. Then something happened in his face that Caleb had not seen there all evening and would not see there again, a release sudden and complete, like a tension that had been held so long it had become invisible until it was gone. He breathed out through his nose. Tell her, Dutch said, answering the question Caleb hadn't asked. Where? Rest stop outside Kingman. He'd pulled over. Dutch pocketed the phone. It's handled. Caleb didn't ask what handled meant. He focused on the wall above the workbench and kept his expression level, and filed that word in the same place he'd filed everything else that didn't belong to his immediate world. I want to take the bike out again, Grip said. Both Caleb and Dutch looked at him. Not a test ride, just out. He looked at the knucklehead. Something in the way he looked at it had changed from when he'd first rolled it through the bay door that afternoon. The machine was the same, better than the same, but Grip's relationship to it had shifted in some way that Caleb could feel without being able to name. She runs right. She runs better than she has since Roy Dunbar built her, Caleb said. Grip almost smiled. Almost. Then I want to take her out. He walked to the bike and checked it the way a rider checks a bike before getting on. Not because he doubted the work Caleb could tell, but out of habit, out of the ritual that good riders maintain, because the ritual itself is part of the relationship between a man and his machine. He ran his hand along the rebuilt frame section. He checked the front wheel. He looked at the harness routing. Good, he said quietly. To himself or to the bike or to Caleb, it wasn't clear. He rolled it toward the bay door and then stopped and turned around. One more thing, he said. Caleb looked at him. The second score line you found, the shallow one on the front down tube, the unfinished one. Grip's eyes were steady. Teller had the bike 6 weeks before Sacramento. He had it at his shop in Stockton for a month a year ago for what we were told was a routine service. Caleb felt the hair on his forearms move. That first attempt, Grip said, whatever he started and didn't finish the first time something interrupted him. A year ago. He paused. He came back, tried again, and this time he finished it. What stopped him the first time? Grip was quiet for a moment. My dog died, he said. A year ago March, I was not right for a few weeks, not myself. I canceled a lot of things, including a planned ride to Sacramento. Something moved in his face. If I'd made that ride, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. A year ago, a different version of this night had almost existed. A version where no one found anything, where a machine ran perfectly, under 70, where a rider with 10,000 miles of instinct hit 75 on an open highway and felt the engine die and reached for power and pushed through all the way to 80, and where the scored frame did what it was designed to do. You've got a good dog, Caleb said. It came out before he could stop it. He wasn't sure why he said it. Some instinct, some reaching for something human in the middle of everything inhuman about the last 8 hours. Grip looked at him for a moment, and then something in his face shifted, completely shifted in a way that made him look for just a second like a regular person, like a man who missed his dog. Had a good dog, he said. Best I ever had. He turned and walked the knucklehead through the bay door into the dark. The sound of it firing up outside moved through the formation like current through wire. Caleb heard engines respond, not all of them, not the majority, but a dozen or so the men closest to the door, a spontaneous acknowledgement. Then Grip's engine note rose as he pulled out of the lot and onto the county road, and the others settled back, and the night went quiet again. Dutch picked up his coffee. It was cold by now. He drank it anyway. You should look at that envelope, he said. Caleb picked it up, opened it, counted what was inside, and then counted it again because the first count hadn't seemed right. It was 6 months of shop payments. Everything he owed on the building loan 6 months forward, in addition to the loan being cleared. Plus what appeared to be a straight labor charge for the rebuild, calculated at a rate that assumed Caleb's time was worth what a master craftsman's time was worth, which it was, but which no one had ever paid him like it was. That's, he started. Fair, Dutch said. That's what it is, fair. He set down the cup. We pay fair, always have. Whatever else people say about us, we pay fair. Caleb folded the envelope and put it in his back pocket. His hands were steady again. He didn't know when that had happened, somewhere in the last 20 minutes while everything else was happening. The tremor had resolved itself, and his hands had gone back to the state they were always in when there was work to do. He looked at the shop, at the oil on the floor from pulling the knucklehead engine he'd need to clean that, at the cut section of frame tubes sitting on the bench, the evidence of what had been built into this machine and why. At his father's photograph on the wall, the young man in front of the same building 22 years ago, the same sign that was faded now, the same parking lot that was full tonight of men his father had probably never imagined would be standing in it. Outside, somewhere down the county road, the knucklehead was running free, 75 miles per hour and singing. Caleb picked up a shop rag and started cleaning the oil off the floor. He had no idea what the next days were going to look like or the next weeks, or what the offer Grip had made to him actually meant in full, what it would cost, what it would ask, what kind of gravity it would exert on the life he was trying to build in his dead father's shop with $47 in his account and a loan that was as of tomorrow morning gone. He didn't know any of that. What he knew was that a machine had come into his shop broken and had left it right. What he knew was that he'd found what 4 other mechanics missed, not because he was smarter than them, but because he hadn't stopped looking when the obvious places turned up empty. What he knew was that his father had run this shop for 19 years on the principle that the work itself was the answer, that if you did the work correctly, completely honestly, the rest of the questions tended to resolve themselves. He wrung out the rag over the drain and went back for another pass. Dutch watched him from the doorway for a moment. Then he went outside. The formation was still there, still quiet, still waiting for something that Caleb couldn't quite name, for the sound of the knucklehead coming back maybe, for the night to finish becoming what it was becoming. From somewhere down the county road, still distant, but growing that geological engine note was rising, coming back, still running. He heard it before anyone said anything. The knucklehead's engine note rising out of the dark from the east, not urgent, not pushed, just steady and full, and right the way an engine sounds when everything inside it is doing exactly what it was built to do. Caleb wrung out the rag one more time and stood up straight and listened to it come home. The formation heard it too. He could feel the change in the parking lot, that collective shift of attention, 240 men orienting toward the sound, the way a field of sunflowers orients toward light. Not a movement exactly, more like a held breath releasing. The headlight came around the bend and swept across the lot, and the knucklehead rolled in clean and slow, Grip sitting on it the way a man sits on something that belongs to him, and that he'd thought he might lose, and that he now knows he won't. He brought it to a stop at the center of the lot and sat on it for a moment with the engine idling and his hands loose on the bars and his eyes closed, just for a moment. Then he opened them and cut the engine and got off. The silence that followed was different from any of the silences that had come before it that night. Those silences had been charged full of waiting, full of threat, full of the potential energy of things not yet decided. This one was resolved. Something had completed itself in the dark on that county road, something that Caleb couldn't name because he hadn't been there for it and didn't have the right language for it anyway. But he could feel it in the quality of the air. Grip walked straight to the bay door and through it and came to stand in front of Caleb. He put out his hand. Caleb took it. Grip's grip was exactly what you'd expect from a man called Grip. Not a demonstration, not aggressive, just complete. The handshake of someone for whom a handshake means something specific and irreversible. "She's right," Grip said. "Everything you said, everything you built." He held the handshake for a beat longer than normal. Roy Dunbar would have approved. Caleb didn't trust his voice completely, so he just nodded. Grip released his hand and turned and looked at the lot and the formation, and something passed across his face that Caleb would spend a long time afterward trying to describe to himself and never quite managing. It was the expression of a man accounting for what he still has after nearly losing it. Not relief, something older and heavier and more considered than relief. "I owe you a conversation," Grip said, still looking at the lot. "The real one. Not tonight, you've earned the right to sleep. But soon." "About the offer," Caleb said. "About the offer, about what it means and what it doesn't mean and what you'd be walking into with your eyes open." He turned back. "I don't recruit people. I don't pressure people. What I said earlier stands. Think about it. Take the time you need." A pause. "But I want you to know what you'd be saying yes to before you say it." "I want to know that too," Caleb said. Dutch appeared in the doorway behind Grip. He had his phone in his hand again, and his expression had the quality of someone who had been receiving information in installments all evening and had just received the final one. He looked at Grip and gave a single small nod. Grip took that in. He was still for a moment. Then he said quietly to Caleb, "It's finished." Caleb understood what that meant and chose again not to ask for details. "Okay," he said. "The people Teller was talking to," Grip said, "the federal case. That's a more complicated problem, and it doesn't resolve tonight. But the immediate threat," he stopped. "You don't need the particulars." "No," Caleb agreed, "I don't." Dutch came fully into the shop and sat down on the stool near the workbench, the stool that customers sat on when they were waiting for an estimate or a verdict on something they'd brought in, and looked at Caleb with that steady professional gaze. "There's something you should know," he said. "Something Grip and I talked about on the phone while you were on the test ride." Caleb waited. "The men outside," Dutch said. 240 of them, plus the 12 who went east. They're from 6 different charters. Some drove 3 hours to get here tonight." He let that land for a second. "Grip made 4 calls when he understood what you'd found. 4 calls. In 40 minutes from 6 charters, 255 men were on the road." He looked at Caleb steadily. "Do you understand what that means?" "It means he matters to a lot of people," Caleb said. "It means that what you did tonight, finding that device, fixing that bike, keeping him alive to make those 4 calls, it matters to a lot of people. Not abstractly, specifically. 255 specific people and the people who matter to each of them." Dutch picked up the cold coffee cup and then set it back down. "I want you to understand the actual scale of what happened in this shop today." Caleb looked at the floor. He looked at the oil stain he'd mostly cleaned, and the ghost of it that would probably never fully come out of the concrete. He thought about that scale, tried to hold it in his mind, the way you try to hold a number that's too large for intuitive comprehension. A man, his machine, a device built to end both, and a 19-year-old who couldn't leave a puzzle alone. I was just fixing a bike, he said. No, Dutch said. You were just doing your job. There's a difference. Grip had moved back to the knucklehead. He was doing what he'd done before, running his hand along the rebuild section, checking things that didn't need checking, performing the ritual of contact that meant something beyond the physical inspection. He stopped at the weld Caleb was most proud of, the main structural repair, the one that had taken the longest and mattered the most, and pressed it with his thumb, the way Caleb had pressed the suspicious seam 8 hours ago. It didn't move. It was never going to move. Who taught you to weld like this? Grip said. My dad? How old were you? 11. He put me on thin wall chromoly to start, said if I could weld that without blowing through, I could weld anything. Caleb paused. I burned through 17 pieces before I got a bead he'd accept. Grip made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh. 17. He kept every bad piece, kept them in a box labeled tuition, said the day I could weld chromoly clean, those pieces paid for themselves. What happened to the box? It's in the back, Caleb said, on the shelf behind the TIG welder. Grip looked at him for a moment. Your father sounds like someone worth knowing. He was, Caleb said. He was exactly that. The silence that followed was comfortable in a way that none of the evening's previous silences had been. Caleb noticed that and filed it the way comfort can arrive in the most unlikely rooms if enough truth has been spoken in them. Dutch stood up from the stool. I'm going to go talk to the men, he said. Give you 2 a minute. He went out through the bay door, and Caleb heard his voice begin low, direct the cadence of a man addressing a group that respects him. Grip stayed where he was beside the bike. I need to ask you something, he said, and I want you to answer it the same way you answered everything else tonight. Straight, okay? When you opened that frame, when you found the sleeve and understood what it was, you had a choice. You could have closed it back up and told me you couldn't find the problem, told me to take it somewhere else, walked away. He looked at Caleb directly. Why didn't you? Caleb thought about it, thought about the 4 seconds he'd stood there with the flashlight and the channel locks and the knowledge of what he was looking at and about what had moved through him in those 4 seconds. Not bravery, not some cinematic surge of heroic resolve. Something quieter and more durable than that. Because it was in my shop, he said. Someone brought a murder weapon into my father's shop and told me to fix it. And whether they knew that's what it was or not, he stopped. I knew once I knew I couldn't unknow it, and a thing you know is your responsibility. Grip was quiet for a moment. A thing you know is your responsibility, he repeated. My dad said something like that, different words. Smart man. Grip looked at the photograph. I'm going to tell you something that I don't say often, and I need you to hear it as what it is, not as payment or transaction. He turned back. What you did here tonight, the way you did it, the discipline of it, the honesty of it, it reminded me of something I'd started to forget about what it looks like when a person does their work without flinching. He paused. I needed to see that tonight, of all the nights. Caleb didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. Outside, Dutch's voice had finished. A different sound had started, a murmur moving through the formation, low and collective, the sound of 240 men processing and responding to something they'd just been told. Caleb couldn't make out words, but the quality of it had shifted from the patient waiting that had characterized the last 2 hours to something more active, more present. Then one engine fired, then another, then 10 more, then 20, and then it was all of them, the full formation coming to life in a wave that started at the back of the lot and moved forward, and the sound built to something that Caleb felt in his back, molars, and his breastbone, simultaneously 240 motorcycles at idle, filling the valley air with a sound that had no equivalent in ordinary life, something that was more like a geological event than a noise. Grip walked to the bay door and looked out at it. Caleb came to stand beside him. What he saw in that parking lot, what he would see in his memory for the rest of his life, with the specific clarity that extreme moments leave behind, was not what he expected. He'd expected something aggressive, something that matched the thunder of the engines. Instead, what he saw was orderly and almost formal, the way a military ceremony is formal. 240 men on their machines, Headlights forward a formation that had a geometry and a discipline to it that was unmistakably deliberate, facing the shop, facing Grip, facing in some way that Caleb couldn't entirely articulate facing him. Dutch was standing at the front of the formation. He looked at Grip. Grip raised his right hand palm out. Every engine in the lot revved once together, synchronized a single massive voice, and then dropped back to idle. Caleb's chest did something he hadn't expected. He put his hand on the doorframe to steady himself, because the sound had moved through him in a way that wasn't about volume or mechanics, but about something older, something that a human body recognizes before a human mind can explain it. The sound of a community speaking in one voice. He wasn't part of it. He knew that. He was standing in a doorway watching something he'd never been invited into and never would be, something that had its own history and its own weight and its own costs that he couldn't fully comprehend. But he'd been at the edge of it tonight in a way that mattered. He'd been necessary, and that was its own kind of belonging. Grip lowered his hand. He turned to Caleb. "There's one more thing," Grip said. Caleb looked at him. "Phil Coretti," Grip said. "So, your loan, I told you I had already planned to deal with it before tonight." He paused. "That's true, but I want to be straight with you about why." He looked at the photograph of Caleb's father again. He'd looked at it several times that evening. Caleb had noticed always the same way, the way you look at something that confirms a decision you have already made. 15 years ago in Bakersfield, your father worked on a bike for a friend of ours named Eddie Ruiz. Eddie was having a bad year. Worse than bad. The kind of year that ends some people. He stopped. Your father knew what was happening with Eddie. Not because Eddie told him, your father just saw it the way some people can see that kind of thing in another person. And he didn't say anything. He just kept Eddie busy, kept finding reasons for Eddie to come to the shop, kept him working on things with his hands. Grip was quiet for a moment. Eddie's been clean for 12 years. Has a daughter now, she's 9. He looked back at Caleb. Your father never said a word about it, never mentioned it, just did what he did and let it be what it was. Caleb's throat had closed almost completely. Eddie told me about it 2 years ago, Grip said. Said he'd always wanted to find a way to say something, to do something, but your father was already gone and the shop was struggling and he stopped. Tonight is that something. What happens to this shop from here forward is partly Eddie Ruiz's long overdue thank you to a man who kept him alive long enough to have a daughter. The formation outside had begun slowly to move. Not leaving, not yet, just a subtle reorganization. Bikes shifting to face the road, the geometry of departure beginning to take shape. Dutch came back through the bay door and picked up his jacket from the chair where he'd left it and put it on without hurrying. Caleb found his voice somewhere. I didn't know about Eddie. Your father wouldn't have mentioned it, Grip said. That's exactly why I'm mentioning it now. He put his hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder, one firm contact, direct and unambiguous, the way everything this man communicated was direct and unambiguous. The debt doesn't go away because you're Robert Turner's son. It goes away because you earned it again tonight on your own. He dropped his hand. But I wanted you to know it was there. I wanted you to know your father's work followed him. Dutch came to stand beside Grip, the two of them together in the doorway looking at the young mechanic who had started this day with $47 in a failing shop and a payment he couldn't make, and who was ending it in a completely different world than the one he'd woken up in. The offer stands, Grip said, official. Think about it. I will, Caleb said. And then because it was true, and because his father had raised him to say true things when they mattered, I already know what I'm going to say. Grip looked at him. I'm going to say yes, Caleb said. I'll do the work on your bikes. All of your bikes, however many charters, whatever they need. But on my terms, by which I mean my shop, my methods, my timeline on what the job requires. I don't cut corners, and I don't do work I don't believe in, and I don't certify something I'm not certain about. He held Grip's eyes. If those terms work, we've got a deal. Something happened in Grip's face. The closest thing to a full smile that Caleb had seen there all evening, not wide, not performed, just real. There and then controlled. Those terms work, he said. Dutch held out his hand. Caleb shook it. Welcome to a more interesting life, Dutch said. I've had enough interesting for one day, Caleb said. Dutch actually laughed at that. A short, genuine laugh, the kind that surprised the person producing it. He shook his head and went out through the bay door, and Caleb heard his bike fire up and he went. Grip picked up his helmet from the bench where he'd set it when he first came back from the test ride. He looked at the knucklehead one more time, a long, full look of a man saying something without words. Roy Dunbar built that bike in 1947, he said. He rode it for 23 years before he died. After him, it went to his son, then 3 other owners, then came to me. He put the helmet on and fastened the strap. 17 people connected to it over 77 years. You're the first one who ever saved it from itself. He paused. She's going to carry that. He walked out. Caleb heard the knucklehead fire that familiar geological deep earth rumble, and then Grip moved out of the lot and onto the road, and the formation fell in behind him in a sequence that had an order and a logic to it. Front bikes pulling out first, then the main body, then the rear. A process that, despite involving 255 machines, was accomplished with a precision that took Caleb's breath away. He stood in the bay door and watched them go. It took several minutes. Not because they were slow, because there were so many of them, each one moving through the lit circle of the pole lamp and then disappearing into the dark beyond. It is swallowed by the California night, one by one the sound of them enormous, and then diminishing, and then distant. He stood there until he couldn't hear them anymore. The valley was very quiet after that, the kind of quiet that follows something large, where the silence itself has a texture to it from everything that was in the space before. The alfalfa fields smelled of irrigation water. Somewhere across the road, the red-tailed hawk that had given up on the heat this afternoon had apparently returned. He could hear it, or thought he could, a single high note carried on air that had finally begun to cool. Caleb Turner stood in the doorway of his father's shop, which was now his shop with no debt on it and no threat over it, in a future that had rearranged itself completely in the last 8 hours into something unrecognizable from what it had been this morning. He was 19 years old. He had $47 in his checking account, or he had until Dutch's envelope, which he'd count properly in the morning because some things deserve better light and a clear head. He had a 76 Sportster in the back that needed a new front tire. He had a workbench with a cut section of 1947 frame tubing sitting on it and a weld on the floor drain he'd done when he was 14 that his father had told him was the first truly good weld he'd ever seen from him. He had a photograph on the wall of a young man in front of this building 22 years ago with his whole life in front of him and no idea what shape it would take. He went inside, he cleaned the workbench. He put the cut frame section in a clean bin and labeled it not for any practical reason, just because his father had taught him that everything in a shop deserved to be properly labeled. He swept the floor around the lift. He turned off the fluorescent overheads and left the work lamp on the way. His father had always left it because a shop with a light on is a shop that's still working. His father said, even when the mechanic's gone home. He picked up his coffee cup and rinsed it in the small sink and set it to dry. He looked at the space where the knucklehead had stood. The floor there was cleaner than the surrounding concrete actually, because he'd swept specifically around where it had been parked, and the oil from the rebuild had been mopped up, and what was left was just the faint impression of a machine that had been there and was now gone, carrying its rebuilt self out into a world that had tried to take it apart in a very different way and failed. He thought about his father keeping Eddie Ruiz alive by keeping him busy with his hands. He thought about how a thing you do without announcement, without expectation of credit, without even fully understanding its own importance, can travel through time and arrive years later as something that saves your son's shop. He thought about how cause and effect in a human life is almost never visible while it's happening, how the threads run underground for years and only surface when the outcome is already determined. He turned off the work lamp. He stood in the dark for a moment. Then he said to nobody, and to his father, and to the empty space where a legendary machine had idled and then run free, "I got it, Dad." He locked the bay door. He walked to his truck. He sat in it for a moment without starting it, listening to the silence of the valley, which was complete and clean and enormous. Then he started the engine and drove home. Behind him, the sign above the bay door, Turner's Automotive and Cycle Repair, sun-faded and slightly crooked on its bracket, 22 years old and still readable, caught the last light from the pole lamp and held it for a moment. Then the light cycled off on its timer, and the sign went dark, and the lot was empty, and the shop stood in the California night doing what good shops do when the work is finished and the doors are locked and the people who built them are gone. It stood. It stayed. It would be there in the morning. And in every shop that has ever earned that right, that is enough. That is everything. That is the only ending a life's work ever truly needs.